In the last section, you read about the end of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of nationalism in the Middle East. In this section, you'll learn about nationalism in Africa and Asia. In India, the followers of Mahatma Gandhi used the methods of civil disobedience to protest British laws. Movement towards independence in Africa. Black Africans fought in World War I in British and French armies. Many Africans hoped that they would be rewarded with independence after the war. But the peace settlement after World War I was a big disappointment. Germany lost its African colonies, but they were given to Great Britain and France as mandates. Britain and France now controlled much of Africa. After World War I, Africans became more active in politics. The Africans who had fought in the war had learned new ideas about freedom and nationalism. Many Africans decided to seek reforms. In Kenya, Harry Thuku organized the Young Kikuyu Association. In 1921, it protested the high taxes imposed by the British. Thuku was arrested. When an angry crowd demanded his release, government forces fired on the crowd and killed 50 people. In Libya, forces led by Omar Mukhtar used guerrilla warfare against the Italians and defeated them several times. The Italians reacted by creating concentration camps and using modern weapons against the revolt. Mukhtar's death ended the revolt. Although the colonial powers often used force against independence movements, they also began to make some reforms. But the reforms were too few and too late. By the 1930s, more and more African leaders were calling for independence, not for reform. Many of the new African leaders had been educated in Europe and the United States. They were influenced by the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Du Bois was an African-American educated at Harvard University. He was the leader of a movement that tried to make all Africans aware of their cultural heritage. Garvey was a Jamaican who lived in Harlem. He stressed the need for the unity of all Africans, a movement known as Pan-Africanism. His Declaration on the Rights of the Negro People of the World had a strong impact on African leaders. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya wrote a book, Facing Mount Kenya, in which he argued that British rule was destroying the traditional culture of the African peoples. Leopold Senghor, a poet, organized an independence movement in Senegal. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria began a newspaper, the West African Pilot. He believed in nonviolence as a method to gain independence. Despite the efforts of these leaders, the independence movements in Africa were not successful until after World War II. The movement for Indian independence. Mohandas Gandhi had become active in the movement for Indian self-rule before World War I. The Indian people began to call him India's great soul, or Mahatma. He began to organize mass protests to achieve his goals. He believed in nonviolence and protested British laws by using the methods of civil disobedience, or refusal to obey laws considered to be unjust. In 1919, the protests led to violence. In response, British troops killed hundreds of protesters. Gandhi was arrested for his role in the protests and spent several years in prison. In 1935, Great Britain passed the Government of India Act. It gave Indians a greater role in the governing process. The Legislative Council became a two-house parliament. Two-thirds of its members were to be elected. 5 million Indians were given the right to vote, although this was still only a small fraction of the total population. The Indian National Congress, or INC, had been founded in 1885 to try to reform Britain's government of India. Reforms were no longer enough for many of the members of the INC. Motilal Nehru, the new leader of the INC, pushed for full independence. Gandhi was released from prison and returned to his policy of civil disobedience. Nonviolence was still at the center of his policy. Gandhi led a protest against the British salt tax. Britain had increased the tax and prohibited the Indian people from manufacturing or harvesting their own salt. In 1930, Gandhi and his followers walked to the sea. This became known as the Salt March. When they reached the coast, Gandhi picked up a pinch of salt. Thousands of Indians did the same. Gandhi and many other members of the INC were arrested. In the 1930s, there was a new leader in the Indian independence movement. Jawaharlal Nehru, the son of Motilal Nehru, was a new kind of Indian politician. He was upper class and intellectual. He had studied law in Great Britain. The indigenous movement now split into two paths. Gandhi's movement was religious and traditional. Nehru's movement was secular and modern. Hostility between Muslims and Hindus complicated the situation in India even further. Muslims were dissatisfied with the INC because Hindus dominated it. In 1930, the Muslim League called for the creation of a separate Muslim state called Pakistan in the northwest part of the country. Conflict between Muslims and Hindus grew.